Okay, let's jump right in, if we could. Graceful Journey. This is the healthcare directive program that was run by the Minnesota Council of Churches, and Honoring Choices is the one that's run by the Twin Cities Medical Society. Minnesota Council of Churches isn't doing it quite so much anymore, but Honoring Choices certainly is, and it's one of several resources, both locally and what you can find online, that will be very helpful to you, I think, as you either work on your own advance directive or for someone that you might be working with. So, what is advanced care planning? You'll find this handout, advanced care planning versus a healthcare directive. So, advanced care planning is an ongoing process. It's something that you do all the time. It's dialogical, and it can be kind of fluid as you let people know your wishes. A healthcare directive is a legal document. It's one that's signed and witnessed, sometimes notarized, and will often appear in a patient's permanent medical record. It might be something that your physician has a copy of, your church has a copy of. And it gets updated from time to time at particular points in your life that we'll discuss a little later on in our session. There are lots of treatment options, some of which are listed there. It's a list that's a lot longer than that, and so what you'll find is that most templates, most healthcare directives don't get too specific, but in fact they leave it to the healthcare agent to determine whether something might or might not be done if you can't speak for yourself. A healthcare directive only kicks in when you can't speak for yourself. So as long as you're alert, conscious, oriented, you don't need it. But if time should come where you can't speak for yourself, it's really very important. So advanced care planning is a process, and advanced directive is a document. I'm not going to tell you what your end-of-life decision should be, or if you should end up in a situation where you can't decide about one kind of treatment or other, even though you might be younger or not at the end of life. You make those decisions yourself, usually after conversation with family and friends. And I think it's yellow, the document that says that your conversation starter kit is a very helpful piece of, very helpful document to work with a loved one on, because you might want some things that they're not so comfortable with. But the way it works is that whoever your healthcare agent is, they need to do what you want, not what they want. If you don't do this, making decisions may create ethical dilemmas or even conflict with people that you love. One of my friends here in town, her father recently passed away, and he had an advanced care directive, but he listed his daughter and his two sons as his healthcare agent with equal powers. It was a terrible decision because you know what? They disagreed. Two of them thought it should go one way, one of them thought it should go another, and it was just a nightmare. So when it comes to picking a healthcare agent, you can have a primary agent and a backup agent, but please don't put two names on the primary line. Won't be very, very helpful. So conversations about the journey from life to death can be difficult. Consider these stories.
Do you think it's important for people to discuss end-of-life issues?
It's hard enough that you don't even say, I love you on a regular basis, so to start talking about death is a very sensitive subject, period.
I think it's important to know what they want, but also have that conversation about if you would feel comfortable making those decisions for them.
Should I say that it's okay to let her have 2 or 3 other procedures when even the end result is she's going to end up passing?
Have you had that conversation?
I have not.
Why do we have so many people who are dying in ways that they did not want? Often ways that are more painful, more isolated than they wanted.
My mom had dementia at the end of her life, and she couldn't decide what she wanted for lunch, let alone what she wanted for health care.
We were on a screen porch and asked him about what he wanted, but it was hard to talk about.
In a situation where there haven't been conversations, what I witness is unnecessary suffering. When suffering is prolonged I feel like I'm not able to care for people in the way they ought to be cared for.
I don't know if I'm ready to have the conversation with mom or dad, and then it's always too early until it's too late.
These are things that are best discussed way before a crisis.
I felt shocked, blindsided, unprepared. And after my mother's death, I began to talk with others and did discover that I was not the only one. You have to have these conversations. You do not know what the people you love want until you talk about it.
So, how is it that it's likely that we might die? You know what the story is in your family, your relatives, you know your own health history, but we look at the entire population and it's kind of interesting. 10% of us are going to die because of an accident, homicide, suicide, or overdose. 90% will die from an illness of some kind or another. Every day, 10,000 baby boomers turn 65, so we're living longer. We heard that earlier today from Linda. By 2030, 20% of Americans are going to be 65 or older. 80% of seniors have one chronic health condition. 50% have two or more, which might be true for all of us here, that we have two or more. 25% of American adults provide daily care for a parent or a relative, and the death of a spouse increases the surviving spouse's chances of death by 35 to 45%, if the spouse had not died, because there's a layer of grief and complexity and change that can be debilitating. Sometimes you'll hear that people seem to die of a broken heart. Somehow our emotional well-being and our physical well-being can be tied up when we experience a big loss. The odds of dying from any particular cause here in our country, this is from the National Safety Council, heart disease and cancer are most common, fireworks is the least likely, and a whole lot of stuff in between that brings about the end of life.
And actually, I could say that in Minnesota, the top two are reversed. There's more.
Oh, it's cancer then. So yeah,
close, but
it's demographically based and depends on where you live. So unless you die by fireworks, a time might come that you can't speak for yourselves, and that's why it's really important that you know what your wishes are, that others know what your wishes are. And so we're going to do a little exercise just now that's going to help you get at that. Caregivers have to do what the patient wants, and that's why they're always talking to family members in the absence of a healthcare directive. Well, what did your loved one think about this? Did they ever talk about what might happen what they might want to have happen if they become unresponsive and are stuck on a ventilator and need lots of high-powered medication to keep their heart going? You always have to try and figure out what the patient wants. So the ways that the caregivers can know this is because you tell them, or you have an advanced care directive that tells them, or you have a healthcare agent that fills in the gaps if the advanced directive doesn't address something in particular. Or someone quotes you. When I was more active in this, working in hospitals, it was just interesting to me how just enormous life and death decisions were made by the littlest of comments that sometimes people said, do you remember when George Clooney was pounding on the chest of that guy on ER and Dad said he would never want that? The doctors taking a little note and said, patient said he did not want CPR. And all of a sudden now they've got documentation, not from the family, but from the patient, him or herself. Once in his life he said that he wouldn't want that, and the children agreed. And that sometimes is enough to be less aggressive with treatment. Someone quotes you. Fascinating to me how that can happen. Oh, choosing a healthcare agent. So we're going to think a little bit about that. There's a paper in your, what color is it? It's white here, choosing a healthcare agent. This is the person who makes decisions for you when you can't make them yourself. It needs to be somebody you trust, doesn't have to be a relative, often is. You can name 2 or more people, but if you do this, you should have a primary and a backup. The name will be on the directive. They don't have to be local. The conversation can happen over the phone, but they have to be reachable. So you'll always want to indicate ways of contacting these people. And when we look at the directive in a minute, you'll see that cell phones are asked for and email addresses and so forth. So you got to be able to find them. So you just absolutely have to have a way of finding the healthcare agent, and that's why it's important to have a backup. So for example, in my case, my primary healthcare agent is my wife. My backup is my niece, who's an OB/GYN doctor here in town. And I trust both of them to make the decisions I would want. Not necessarily the decisions they would want, but the decisions that I would want. And so familiarity is required. It needs to be somebody that knows you, which is why healthcare agents for hire, as we heard about earlier today, that's where the ice gets a little thin, because they might not know you very well. All they can do when the time comes is have conversations with people who do know you and gather enough information to make the correct decision. There's the document. So read your way through that. Maybe you already have a healthcare directive, maybe not. If you don't, then you need to think about who would that be. In families, I've often heard, I suppose I should have my oldest child, but my oldest child just hates hospitals and doesn't like anything to do with healthcare. But my middle kid is all right with that. So it's not necessarily the oldest one. And certainly you need to tell them. And you need to have a conversation not only with the potential agent, but with everybody else who would need to know who that agent is. And there are all sorts of complexities that can occur when you come to a point in your life you can't speak for yourself any longer. And no care directive is exhaustive. It will never cover all the things that might come up. So do you want antibiotics if you should develop an infection? That's not in most healthcare directives. But if you don't get antibiotics and you should happen to come down with pneumonia and you can't say whether you want antibiotics or not, your healthcare agent has to make that call based on their knowledge of you. And there might be a bias towards treatment. Certainly the healthcare system is biased towards treating rather than not treating. And so I always tell people, if you don't have a healthcare directive, the hospital has one for you. And so does the state of Minnesota. And it might not say what you want, but it is biased toward treatment rather than not treating, because a physician or a hospital is never going to experience a lawsuit if they did too much. And family are sort of upset because they overtreated. But on the other hand, if they make a decision to do less and the patient dies, then, some cousin from Schenectady might have something to say about that. So when I mentioned earlier that I have friends where there were two healthcare agents mentioned and they had equal priority, it was just harder than the dickens to work through that, and we had to come up with some kind of compromise that they could all three live with. One sided with the other, but the son and the daughter just didn't agree. So it takes a lot more effort, and particularly if the directive itself isn't specific about what you might want. So, onward. People of faith, it's not so bad, the whole thing about dying, but as an old colleague, a fellow named Ed from First Baptist Church in Florida said, I'm not worried about being dead, but dying has me nervous. And how we get from here to there. He had leukemia. So what do you want when you're dying? Look at this interesting statistic. The things that physician wants and the things that people on the street want. These are all the things that are always talked about when it comes to heroic or extraordinary treatment, and there's variation depending on where you are. What's heroic in Minneapolis might not be so heroic at Johns Hopkins, and what's heroic at Johns Hopkins would be unthought of in an underdeveloped country. But some physicians were asked, this is quite some time ago, but it hasn't too much changed. The only thing they want is pain meds, and the only thing that the general public doesn't want is pain meds. So, they don't care if they can't talk anymore, if all of this is going on. But of course, morphine, which is the most common pain medicine that's delivered near the time of death, can make it difficult to talk and communicate. So now it's time to create a healthcare directive. The one I have for you is from Honoring Choices. There's a short version and a long version. The short version is just a couple pages long. The long version I think is about 8 pages long. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through it right now, except to just hit some of the highlights, so I'm sure that you understand. And we'll just go from page to page. It's not just for end of life, but it's whenever you can't speak for yourself. You should be specific about what you want and you don't want, so there are places to write in particular directions. And you can ask your healthcare provider what the implications are about those decisions. So if you do one of these, then you should bring it to, an office visit next time you visit with your physician, who will not only want to scan it into your medical record, but might want to talk to you about it and say, well, what does it mean that you want this and you don't want that? Assuming that that person might be there should you become extremely ill. And if you have any earlier versions, you should get rid of them. So always remember that when you do a new document, it's just like a will, last will and testament. It's the one with the most recent date that counts. Okay. Long or short, that's up to you. Short is pretty simple, and it just will list some general things and then what you want, who you want your agent to be. So down at the bottom, we're now on the longer form, the one that says English at the top. You want to put your name and the date that you did it. This is what matters because we always want the most recent one. So that's on this first page. The rest is just sort of obvious. It's who you are. Oh, I have to go back. That's too important to skip. So your healthcare agent. It says, if I can't communicate my wishes and healthcare decisions due to illness or injury, this is the person I pick. I don't know who that is for you, but I hope you have somebody in mind. And remember, there's got to be a way to find them. And then the alternate healthcare agent. And you can have a second alternate if you want to, if there's any chance at all that both of the primary and the backup wouldn't be available. Then you date and sign that page. Page 2. The powers of my agent. These are typical, as it appears there in the middle of the page. And I'll just say this now, they vary from state to state. And I've not heard of a Minnesota directive not working in Florida or Arizona, but you should check with your healthcare provider, assuming you have one in both places. Some people travel with these documents if you're just vacationing. Additional powers: make decisions about the care of my body after death. Continue as my agent even if our marriage or domestic partnership ends. So a lot of times you'll have your spouse, but what do you do if you get divorced? Well, do you still want that person to be your agent? You might not. Depends on how the divorce went, maybe. Make healthcare decisions if I can decide or speak for myself because you trust them that much. Might be more collaborative, but if you seem like you may not be competent to the caregivers, even though you're awake, they could continue to act. If I'm pregnant, decide whether to continue with the pregnancy. So again, sign, date, down at the bottom of that page. Healthcare instructions. So these are sort of the big ticket items. I want CPR. If yes, then check that. I want CPR if my breathing stops. But if the future of my health has changed, I have an incurable illness, no reasonable chance of survival, little chance of long-term survival, then I really don't want that. Or I don't want CPR ever. So CPR is the sort of the big ticket item that you hear about all the time, but in reality it's sometimes the medications that are being pushed through your IV line that keeps your heart going. CPR is like the 2-minute warning in football. When you get that, there's not much time left. And a successful conversion of a patient whose heart has stopped back to having a viable life is very rare. Some say less than 5%, even with witnessed arrests. So when your heart stops, it's sending a big message to you and everybody else that your time with us may be over. But one can extrapolate based on what you said here about what you might want to do with the administration of medications. Date and sign. Here's where you can start getting particular, and we're on page 4. If there are particular illnesses that you're experiencing and you want to address the particular treatments that you might or might not want, you can put it there. And then this one is really important, number 3. Stop or withhold treatments to extend my life, or do all treatments that are recommended by the healthcare team. So this is giving your caregivers some sense of what it is that you want, even though the particular decision may not be reflected here. Make sense so far? Okay, on to the next page. Here's one about organ donation. Do you want to be an organ donor? Yes or no? There are no age restrictions to organ donation. When I was active in it, I think the oldest liver donor we worked up was 85. And now sometimes they're even transplanting HIV positive patients into other HIV positive patients. So there's no worry of transmission of that illness because it's already present in the recipient. Whenever you get a driver's license, you're asked this question, so this is a backup to that. Organ donation, yes or no? Any restrictions on that gift? Autopsy, yes or no? If you die as a result of an accident, suicide, or homicide, you don't have any choice. You're going to be going to the medical examiner's office and you will at least receive a paper autopsy, if not a physical autopsy, and the medical examiner is the decider there. If you want an autopsy and the healthcare team isn't interested in it, your family may have to pay for it. So you have to just work that out at the time, or actually your survivors will have to work that out.
Mark, what's a paper autopsy?
Where they do some, they review the case, they take a look at the medical record and see if what happened that's been documented logically can produce a cause of death. It might involve some chemical testing, it might be draw some blood, urine analysis, something other than making a big Y incision in a person's chest to sneak a peek or in their head. So it's not invasive, or not as invasive. It might simply be lab work, maybe an X-ray, but not involving the kind of procedure that you sometimes hear about with an autopsy. So there's levels of autopsies.
So there's not a choice for that paper?
No, either you want it or you don't want it. So, and again, if you have some feeling about that, you can write it in. Sometimes people will say, well, he's suffered enough, don't let him go through. We don't want him to have an autopsy. Well, I'm here to tell you, if I thought there was any suffering involved with autopsy, it would make me pretty uncomfortable. Similarly, if I thought there was any suffering involved with cremation, I wouldn't feel too good about that. So the theory is, it's not you, it's not the patient that's going to be suffering more, it's the family that just can't think of it. And parenthetically, that often is very hard for parents when it comes to the conversation about organ donation, that there's going to be an operation on their child and they just can't bear it. So it can be hard. Really for anyone it can be hard, but when you look at the good that it does, typically, and for a great many people, it outweighs whatever psychologically might be difficult. So again, initial. Now this moves into a more subjective part, and this is one of the things that makes the long form different than the short form, because it talks about what you think and what you believe, things that make my life worth living. There's an interesting lecture out there, I think it's called 99 Things, and if you Google it you could find that. A lecture that, I think he was a caregiver, said here's the things that make my life worthwhile. And then you begin to think, well, if there weren't 99, maybe there's only 50. Is life still going to be worth living? And maybe how about if there were just 25? Are they my favorite 25 and I can still be happy? How about if there's just 1 or 2? It's the very conversation I had with my cousin last Sunday, who felt like he was consuming so many medical resources that, and so I said, well, do you have some joy? Is there joy still coming to you in your life? I said, oh yeah, and he listed the things that made him thankful and made him joyful. I said, well, maybe then it's worth it then, that you're able to receive this, even though you're a pretty sick guy. So I've done this. I've made a list of things that for me are really important, and as they start getting crossed out, as they inevitably will, you have to just decide, is life still worth living? My beliefs about when life would not be worth living, so some people just can't understand the idea of being bedridden, so that might mean that life isn't so worth living, or you need help with bathroom habits. That makes it hard. Whatever you feel like you want to put in there. Thoughts about specific medical treatments, if there are any. Oh, I just don't want to be on a ventilator. I don't want dialysis. That too is up to you. Thoughts and feelings about how and where I'd like to die. What's that old joke? I'd like to die peacefully in my sleep like my grandfather, rather than screaming like the passengers in his car. I'm sorry. Most people say, well, I'd just love to, be on a beach somewhere, or I'd like to be at home surrounded by family and friends. You may get that, you may not, but it's helpful to know. And if a decision has to be made between your death occurring in a hospital or a care facility or at home, what you want can at least be taken into account.
I think it was Woody Allen that said, "I'm not afraid of dying, I just don't want to be there."
When it happens. Yeah, that's right. Or W.C. Fields, all things considered, I'd rather be in Cleveland. And then, if I'm nearing my death, here's some things I want. Rituals, I'd like music playing. I'd like to be able to have people there, my religious affiliation, whatever that may, other wishes and instructions. So this all has to do with the dying process. Realize you're not going to get better from this bad thing that's happened to you, and here's how I'd like my last days and hours to go. And again, this can be helpful to the people that are taking care of you as you write that stuff down. Now, we make it legal. So that's the last page. The next to the last page, where it's witnessed. It doesn't have to be notarized, but it does need to be witnessed and dated. Remember, the person who's witnessing needs to see you sign it. So don't sign it and then take it to them. Wait to do this last page until you're with the one or two people that are going to witness. One witness is enough, two is better, and if you really want to have it notarized, you can do that too. And then the next steps talks a little bit about when you should review it. So you complete your healthcare directive, you give copies to these various entities, and then the suggestion, 5 Ds, as we say, the time to review it is every decade of your life. I just don't think that that's anywhere near often enough. I typically suggest that you do it at least every 2 years, maybe every year. Just look at it, or at least think about it, to see if your answers might have changed. If you experience the death of a loved one, so that will trigger it. I had a family member die last weekend, so I might logically say, there's a cue, so I can do that. It's just reminding me that's important. If a divorce occurs, you might want to reconsider as to who your healthcare agent is. If you get a diagnosis, a worrisome diagnosis, there's a time that you should maybe revisit. And then if you experience a significant decline in your health, a trigger, again, the 5 Ds. So thinking about it more often is better than thinking about it less often. Not doing one is the worst of all. So it really is important to do it. And you might find that there will come a time when you can help your care receiver do this. I think it's perfectly legitimate for you to ask them or their family members, does Fred have a living will or an advance directive? Yes or no? If no, we would do well, both for the sake of the family and for who's going to be caring for them at the end stages of their life, to help them get this done. Honoring Choices has this document online, so you can fill it in and type it out. You don't have to do it in a handwritten way, and 5 Wishes does too, in a number of the onlines. Yep, the hospitals, you can do it online and then just print it off at home, and then it's done, and you can handle updates that way too. If you'd like an electronic copy, and this slide is sort of outdated because now, in fact, Honoring Choices does this online. You don't need to use me to get an electronic copy. So that's a lot of material in 45, 50 minutes, but there's some homework involved with this, and if you don't have a living will, I really hope you get one, an advance directive. Living will is an old term. Advance directive is what typically is used now. We good? We're okay?
Oh, I just wanted to mention another good option besides donating your organs is to donate your body.
Your whole body.
U of M
Yep.
amenity request program.
Yep. You have to do that ahead of time, though. You can't do that when you're dead.
Right.
Yeah, you have to make those arrangements ahead of time, so your family can't say, well, let's just donate Mom to the U. Mom needed to make that arrangement before she died, so then it just kicks into gear, and they'll explain to you how that happens. Very helpful, by the way. So confirm your healthcare advocate's willingness to serve. Meet with a trained facilitator, such as me, if you need help doing this to finalize the document. Make sure you're thinking about those things you want to think about. Use that conversation starter kit with your healthcare agent or other family members. It's helpful. And then distribute the copies of your advance directive, at least to your physician and your healthcare agent. And if you want to bring it to your church, that's fine too. Remember the 5 Ds, even though I don't think decade is anywhere near often enough.
Question. Documents is 5.
Yeah.
5 years. Might not be often enough either.
No, I don't think it. When you reach a certain age, for my 22-year-old son, sure, 5 years is fine. For me, maybe more often than that. Yeah.
How does this fit in with our care receivers?
So I think it's a perfectly fine thing to ask them somewhere in the context of your developing relationship, do you have an advance directive? What's that? Well, that's where if you can't say what you want, if you become very ill, there's a document that will help your family and your caregivers treat you in the way you want to be treated. If they say, oh yeah, I've got that, my physician has it, then you're done. If they say, well, I've never done that, then you could help them get that completed. You could bring them this, a copy of this, and to their family. You could simply have a conversation with them. Well, who would you like to be making those decisions if you can't make them? Getting the document is really good. And if they're in a facility, odds are there is one. Like if they're in a nursing home or even a assisted living facility, they probably got one. But if they're at home, they might not.
So I would think it would be pretty important to get the family in on that, though, you know, I mean.
Yep.
so
Absolutely
that you're not doing
important.
it and then surprise,
Nope.
surprise, yeah.
No, I think you should absolutely, and certainly whoever they say that they want to have as their healthcare agent, that person needs to be brought into the loop. And most of the time it's a family member. If you need help getting it completed, there are people who do this. Here in this church, I'm one of them. Hospitals have that. They'll send people out. Oftentimes it comes out of the social work department. And if somebody's admitted to the hospital, just as you were asked if you have a healthcare directive, if you say no and I want one, they'll send somebody, because nobody likes confusion. They would much rather have it in place, even though it takes a little staff time to get it completed.